Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Boost CYAC's webinar series. This afternoon, myself, along with my colleague Melisa Maltar, are going to spend a little bit of time talking about pornography and speaking with all of you. Before we get to that, we've got a few housekeeping issues that I need to take care of. First, for participants listening in French, please click on the floor button at the bottom left of the screen and select French. To see and follow along with the PowerPoint presentation in English, click Presentation on the top left of the screen. To follow along with the presentation in French, download the French version of the presentation by clicking on Documents to the right. Feel free to download the document and documents of both presentations in English and French by clicking on Documents. We will attempt to have a Q&A with the last few minutes of the presentation this afternoon. And if you're interested in submitting a question, please go to the toolbar on your right, click on the messaging, and then participants, and type your question. You can submit your questions at any point. We're going to try and get to them at the end. And if you're watching this webinar in a group, please enter the number of participants in the group by clicking on messaging and then participants. Now we're going to get going with the pornography discussion. So bear with me. This is my first go with this technology, but we've had some practice, so hopefully it will be a smooth transition. Already not so smooth. We're going to do the share screen. We're going to do the hopefully what you're seeing now is the slides with the presentation. So as you can see, we're going to be talking a little bit about pornography. And when I say pornography, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. There's been a lot of debate about what is porn. Does it have to be violent, softcore versus erotica? Really what I'm talking about here is material that is meant to sexually arouse, and that's the sort of the sole purpose. The other thing I want to...
Hi, Bente. I'm really sorry to interrupt. I'm not seeing the presentation. Melissa, can you confirm if you can see it?
I cannot.
So, Bente, at the top right, click Share Screen, select the window, and share entire screen, and then click Share Now.
Good. Already a bump.
There you go. Perfect. Now you can full screen your PowerPoint.
Okay. Can you see it now?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Okay.
Hit hide on that little thing, and you're all set.
Excellent.
We're good.
So all the practice, I guess, was for naught because I still messed it up. Not a big surprise. Anyway, bear with me. So I'm not going to be specifically trying to, define the kind of pornography we're talking about. But what I will say is I'm talking about pornography. And for just the purposes of today, because we only have a short time, I'm really talking about pornography that is sort of heterosexual in nature. So used primarily with this heterosexual gaze. The other piece that I think is important to note is that when I'm talking about pornography usage or exposure to pornography today, I'm thinking specifically and talking specifically about children and youth. That's the kind of work I do, and so it makes some sense that that's what I'm going to be speaking about. The other piece I have to just forewarn folks about, this is a little bit of a trigger warning. I'm using some graphic language. I'm not showing any porn today. I don't know, there might be cheers or disappointment, I don't know, but there is certainly some strong language, and so I want you to be forewarned about that. And if you're not comfortable, then this might not be a good webinar for you on that front. I have a very big agenda, given that we only have an hour, and I have my colleague with me as well. So the areas we're going to cover are going to be quite brief. Initially, we're going to try to situate ourselves in relation to pornography. What's our relationship with it like? What is new in the pornography research? What are people looking at in the online world? What are some of the potential harms of pornography? And then what is some of sort of the backlash or the pushback against looking at pornography only through a harms view? And that's really where Melissa is going to come in. I'm going to talk a little bit about pornography and sexual scripting theory. We've got some clinical tools and questions and some discussion questions for youth. So if you're in practice with children and youth in your position at work, this might be some possible discussion questions that you might be able to use, whether in a very clinical setting or even in a more generalized setting. Before we move further, I think I have to really connect myself to pornography. So first and foremost, on a personal front, I'm a mom. I've got a son and a daughter. And so trying to figure out, what do I say to them about pornography? What does it mean in their lives, in our lives? You know, that takes on a very personal connection. There's also a political connection for me insofar as I'm rather old. And so, you know, I was sort of grew up with the second wave feminism, and there was certainly a critique back then around pornography. And so some of that has stayed with me. And it's interesting now, there's sort of a new turn, even in sort of the postmodern feminism, that there's a group of feminists that are now beginning again to take up pornography as a problematic area. And that's kind of interesting. So I'm really connected to it from a political place as well. I also have a academic connection because in 2007, I completed my dissertation and I looked at pornography exposure in children and youth specifically, and correlations between that and sexual behaviors later in life, the proclivity to engage in what might be deemed sexually offensive behaviors, those kinds of things. And so I really had a strong interest in that. My practice background comes from working with young people who have committed sexual offenses. And so, of course, hearing their stories, I was hearing a lot about pornography. And my interest really got piqued in, are these kids looking at more porn than the rest of the world, or the rest of the kids that are not in a clinical sample? And when I went to go and looked at the literature to see, well, what is the rest of the kids looking at? There really wasn't much there then. And this was back in 2007. And so that's really where my interest came from on that front. As we move along, I think when we go to engage in discussions with pornography with children and youth, we have to be able to sort of situate ourselves in relation to pornography. Typically, this brings out a lot of strong feelings in us, one way or the other. You know, we've got some pretty hardcore values often that are attached. And if we think about it as sort of a bit of a continuum, where on the one end, we think about pornography as sinful or evil, or it stands in direct contrast to our values. And on the other end, it's really sanctioned or seen as neutral, minimally, or morally good, as a way to really engage in and express sexualities of all kinds. We have to really think about where we sit on that continuum for ourselves. And the reason we have to be really carefully and critically thinking about that is because if we're sitting at one end or the other on this continuum without having some critical thought about it, what we could do then when we're engaging with the young people with which we work is really be either shaming or encouraging. So at either end, there's some risks involved. So we ideally, if we can sit somewhere near the middle when we're engaged in practice, I think that's a safer bet. Now, I can tell you, I situate myself a little bit left of center, and part of the reason I invited my colleague, Melisa, to join me today is that she situates herself a little bit to my right. So she's a little bit down more on the sanctioned end, and I'm a little more on the censored end. But I think, you know, there's space for lots of different feelings and attitudes about this. The other thing that connects to this and the way that we put things together, especially when we're doing clinical work, is our thoughts about how we see children, right? So if we think sort of in the modern era, sort of the positive understanding of what a child is, we see them as children who need to be protected. This would be taking on like a just say no kind of approach to pornography, where we have to censor them and we have to do everything we can to make sure that they don't have access to those materials. And there's lots of websites and lots of information out there on the web about, you know, controls and protections that we can use so that children can't access these materials. And that's all really important and really positive. And that's sort of if we see the child as vulnerable. The other end, in sort of the more postmodern understanding of children is sort of as really an agenic child, or a really savvy kind of child or youth who, has to on a daily basis already navigate a very complicated world online. And so for them, the practice response is more around providing them with the critical tools. How are they going to deconstruct pornography when they see it? What are they going to do with it? How are they going to navigate and negotiate with it when they come across it in their lives, with the expectation that they're going to? So you can see that those are very different ends of the continuum. So what does the research say about pornography? What does the latest research say about pornography? Well, I can tell you with certainty that children and youth are seeing pornography. There's no question about that. And I can tell you that in my own research, the mean age was about 11.8 years of age when children and youth saw their first pornography. You can see that the CDC has got some data about by 18 years of age, most kids had seen pornography. This is really common in any of the research studies that we're looking at in terms of child and youth exposure, that it's a pretty high rate. The other piece that we have to know and think about is that a good chunk of pornography pornography exposure is unintentional. So this is kids or youth who come across pornographic content, turning a channel on the television set, by Googling something that is sort of a surprise at the other end. So unwanted sometimes, but unintentional exposure. But the impact of that exposure can be the same. And so that's the other piece that we have to think about. Some of the research has really tried to define who uses pornography in a regular way. Males more than females, pubertally more advanced, more sensation seekers. And the last piece around the pornography and the sexual behavior and attitudes is there has been a great deal of research in pornography about, does pornography contribute to poor attitudes or violence against women? And I can tell you that there's probably been as many studies that demonstrate it has as those that haven't. And so what we're left with then is this, that the truth about pornography is the same back in 2001 when Joseph Slade made this comment as it is today, with all of the conflicting claims that some pornography, under some circumstances, may affect some people in some ways, some of the time. And that's what we're kind of left with. Now, that's not so helpful in terms of our knowledge base about pornography, but it certainly opens the doors to a lot of potential implications. So as the research continues on and there's more and more studies, and we've had meta-analysis done that stand in stark contradiction to other meta-analysis in terms of what they're finding about the impact of pornography use. And so it really is, the jury is still out. So that means that we're left to our own devices in trying to figure all of these things out. So that being said, we also need to know what's being consumed out in the world. And we need to know that because if we're going to engage with children and youth in a practice way, we have to be prepared and have some of the knowledge and the language, even if they're describing things that they're seeing or talking about particular kinds of porn, we need to know what it is that they're talking about. So in the last several years, there's been a real rise in terms of amateur porn stars. So that's people of their own making putting their videos online. It's often free of charge. There's lots of streaming services that provide outlets for this. And so that's a very common thing. The other thing is the Japanese hentai, which, incorporates a lot of drawing, and it comes from a Japanese tradition. You'll hear kids talking about that. Always, as always, the portrayal of young people. So, even in mainstream kind of porn, there's often a real emphasis or an intentionality behind it, where they're trying to make young women appear to be under 18 years of age. Now, they'll often say in fine print at the bottom, these girls are in fact 18, but there's a real attempt there. Gonzo porn, of course, has also been with us for several years now. And that's really that first-person view of pornography. So looking at it it's filmed from first person. So that's where it would be like you're actually in the action. So that's a very kind of common way that pornography is filmed. There seems to be a lot of degradation. Incest porn over the past several years has really been on the upswing, and that's quite concerning, especially for those of us that work with sexual abuse, because a good chunk of sexual abuse happens within a sibling context. The last pornography that I've been seeing more of is sort of degradation kinds of porn, making people sick or name calling, or the ATM porn, which is the acronym stands for ass to mouth porn. So, penis in the ass, then going into a woman's mouth, and without cleaning in between, that kind of thing. So there's a bit of a degradation piece in there, I would suggest. Now, I'm sure others would have lots of other opinions about that. Even if we just look at the Pornhub list of the most searched terms in the last, this is in 2018. If we look at some of the things that are up there, you'll see hentai, teen, stepmom, mom, gangbang. So you can see there's a lot of incest porn or family-directed kind of porn. So it can be quite concerning, in fact. And I just had a look. This is a popular porn site at this vid, and they had a posting of their most watched videos of all time. And you can see, again, there's this level of degradation that seems to be coming in, throat fucking puke compilation. That there's a piece around, can we make a woman vomit by virtue of oral sex going so far back into her throat? And maybe again, it's my age and being a little bit older, but some of this doesn't sit well with me. And I'm trying to imagine some of the young women or girls that I work with and seeing that kind of pornography exposure and what that might mean for them. Now, when I look at these kinds of lists, there's part of me that wonders, is this really about sexual arousal, or is this because these are so kind of extreme that people are watching them as like, wow, that's so incredible? It's difficult to know what's actually happening behind the viewing, just that, this is what they put out as their most popular videos. When we think about the potential risks of pornography, and you'll see on this list, all of these things at different times have got some kind of research tacked behind them that has really looked at pornography and said, porn causes this, or there's a big association with pornography and sexual dysfunction, or attitudes supporting violence against women. So these are the potential risks. And as Joseph Slade reminds us, this isn't going to be the case for everybody, right? Every young person that is exposed to pornography or uses pornography is going to have a different relationship with pornography. But in the same way that we prepare people, even if we're thinking about having safe sex, we prepare people about the risks of having unprotected sex, right? Not necessarily they're going to get an STI, they're not necessarily going to get pregnant, but we talk about the potential risks. In the same way, I like to talk about the potential risks of pornography use or exposure with young people so that at least they can make an informed when they're going into that pornography arena. So we'll go through and have a look at a few of these. So one of the big claims is about the promotion or attitudes supporting violence against women. And I have to say, there's a really interesting TED Talk where Maria Allen, I think is her last name, talks about the process of where violence against women becomes quite sexualized. And I think when she says, physical, verbal, and sexual violence against women is met with approval and encouragement through groans of more and more, and is accompanied by a performance of increased arousal. When we stop and we really think about that, if we're exposing someone to pornography and they don't have any other experience of sex in their life, the thought of women when they're being abused, finding that as an extra turn on, can be quite problematic. And so, although we don't have a particular causal link there necessarily, there's enough there to be concerned, I would suggest. The other piece of the story it talks about in terms of women or people of color or children, it sexualizes them in ways and dehumanizes them in ways that are quite concerning. The other piece about the worry is about this idea around desensitization. I'm going down the rabbit hole. And I've certainly had young men that I've worked with really talk about this, how they started online looking at lesbian porn, for example, and then they found that got boring. And so they moved beyond and they started to look at first person or gonzo porn. And then they need that to be, then it had to be gangbangs or bukkake, that kind of thing. So it's about that gradually increasing the need for more and more explicit pornographic exposure. The other piece is around bad sex. And I can't say enough about that because bad sex, really, it's quite problematic. If young people are using pornography as an educational piece, and there's been lots of research to demonstrate that, including my own, where young people are saying they use it to teach them how to have sex, then the outcome of this is not going to be great sex, because there's a lot of things missing in pornography that help make sex good, and particularly good for women. And here again, I'm speaking only in a heterosexual context, but it's really worth looking at. The other piece is sexual dysfunction. And again, in my own clinical practice, I've had young men talk to me about how, they've been using pornography for a long time and that they can't even masturbate without the use of pornography any longer, or they can't maintain an erection with a partner without also the use of porn being brought in. And to hear young men, 17 or 18 years old, talking about this kind of struggle at such an early age, and really they're linking it to their porn usage, that can be quite worrisome as well. The last piece is around the addiction hypothesis. There's been a lot of people that argue that pornography is technically addicting. And, there's this idea that after we have an orgasm, we release oxytocin. And so that binds us to pornography. But I can tell you there's as many people that would argue, along with my colleague, Melisa Maltar, that pornography addiction is not a real thing. So I'm going to pass it over to her and let her speak to that. I think it's over to you there, Melisa.
Okay. Let me know for, we've met the transition there, Bente. Okay, so I'm going to continue, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what is pornography addiction? Does it actually exist? What the research actually shows is that neither the Diagnostic Statistical Manual or the International Classification of Diseases and the WHO, the World Health Organization, actually classify pornography as a mental disorder or addiction. Overtly, a large number of scientists actively reject that pornography is an addiction as a model. And that's simply because there isn't enough evidence at this point in time to identify that pornography is addictive. The other piece with respect to this argument that pornography is not an addiction is that ultimately it does seem intuitive for it to be true that sex and porn can be addictive. That seems very intuitive. But it actually turns pornography use and sexual behavior as the problems. It labels them as the explanation. And, if you hear a lot of the, hot Hollywood news articles and media surrounding celebrities who identify as having a porn addiction, there's been a large or a sex addiction for that matter, there's been a large self-help industry, lucrative self-help industry surrounding this concept. And it really, there's this impairment around seemingly compulsive sexual behaviors. And that actually might be due to other things and other causes. It really mislabels the deep-rooted causes, which might be connected to that problematic behavior. The other thing is that it really replicates this history of anti-masturbation efforts. Sexuality historically has, and sexuality, including masturbation, sexual behavior, pornography use, have really been scary to society. There's been a lot of fears. Some of the reactions to that behavior is to suppress it. For adults and in the adult literature, pornography can affect people by turning them on, but it doesn't take over or overrides their values. And what I mean by that is simply watching, for example, anal sex. If the viewer finds watching anal sex disgusting or gross, that won't change their belief about it. However, if the viewer who's watching an anal sex video finds it neutral or doesn't find it disgusting at all, then what the science says is that likely watching it will slightly increase the chances of them maybe being a little bit more willing to give it a try. It also identifies, there's been a movement started in 2011 called NoFap. NoFap is a slang term for male masturbation. And NoFap is this online movement to really promote anti-pornography use and anti-masturbation. Of course, it's been criticized as being too oversimplistic, outdated, and incorrect scientifically. As well, as early as the 1800s, the inventor of Kellogg's cornflakes, Mr. Kellogg, actually invented cornflakes the thought at that time was that plain food would really suppress urges, sexual urges, and the thought at that time was that, meat or foods in rich flavors would actually increase sexual desires. So there's this really long history. And of course, we know the history, if you're in Ontario, about this sexual health curriculum and how that's been changed and pushed back over the last couple of years. So there's this long history of replicating anti-sexuality and anti-masturbation efforts. And the other piece is that this porn addiction model resonates with certain groups. And what we mean by that is what the science actually says is that religiosity actually predicts problems with porn use. So if you grow up feeling negative about sexual behaviors, pornography use, but you use it, you discover that you feel guilty, you feel ashamed of those behaviors, you're angry at yourself, and you still have that desire to watch. So that moral incongruence, your beliefs and your behavior, that difference, that incongruence is actually the piece that causes distress. What we actually know about porn is that there is an impact to watch it. There's no denying that. However, it's critical that we begin to help people understand why they are struggling, to unpack the complex moral, religious, developmental, and individual reasons for that struggle. What the literature shows, so these are individuals who do large meta-analyses on adults who do watch pornography. And so what they have found is that people who seek out and watch pornography more compulsively are, before they watch the pornography, generally more aggressive, generally more impulsive, have higher sex drives, are sensation seekers, have this disposition to respond to seeing sexual cues, like they get turned on more easily when they see sexual cues in the media. They tend to have more narcissistic traits. And people who really gravitate to that violent, unhealthy pornography are people who already have that disposition. So pornography doesn't create that in an individual. One already arrives with those characteristics or traits before they actually start the compulsive viewing. And we know that from the literature, what the science actually says is that adults who watch it, what I said previously is specifically related to that incongruence again. So your values and beliefs are here, but your behavior's here. And there's this mismatching of what you believe and what you're actually doing. And that incongruence causes the distress. That's what actually causes a lot of the dysfunctions, is what these large meta-analyses and experts in the field are saying. As well, and a lot of David Finkelhor's work actually speaks to this piece around how society has increased access to pornography. It's so easy to access it now and access it for free, but there's been a real categorical documentation that sex crimes, including exhibitionism, rape, child sexual abuse, have actually gone down. Although this data is correlational, and we know correlation doesn't mean causation, but it's a real interesting piece of information that when you have actual more access to pornography, sex crimes have actually gone down. As well, what we know from adults who view pornography more compulsively or more regularly is that it creates a more permissive attitude around casual sex and more engagement in casual sex overall. And these findings in a lot of these meta-analyses seem to be very robust, as well as people who use internet pornography. They're more likely to endorse sexually objectifying prospective partners and viewing them as instruments for personal pleasure. So that's really what the literature shows. You know, porn, it captures the attention of teens. And so why not use it to teach positive lessons about and potentially create solutions to ending dating and sexual violence? You know, the recent statistics from Pornhub in particular in 2019, they had 42 billion hits a year in 2019. That's 115 million hits a day. You know, most frequent porn watching is between 2 to 6 p.m. and after 11 p.m. So this is when, you know, parents are not home from work or when parents go to bed. Teens are using it. And so why should we keep an open mind about pornography? I'm not promoting using it in clinical work with adolescents, but what I'm saying is that teens are interested in sex, and they've always been. Pornography hasn't changed that, and we've seen that with a lot of that data that David Finkelhor in particular has identified. Our job as helping professionals is to be objective. Our job as helping professionals is also to be sex positive. We know that, and sex positivity ultimately means that you have the right to express your sexuality and your interests in any way that you please, as long as it doesn't result in harm or exploitation of others. And we know very well that abstinence models for teenagers don't work. And so trying to promote this idea of, you know, just saying no is not going to work with teens, nor is it going to equip them to be healthy or to make savvy or healthy decisions in the future. And so much of the debate, and the other piece about why we need to keep an open mind about youth's access to pornography is that there is so much debate out there denouncing or defending pornography use, and we actually don't know too much about it. What we shared with you so far is all we know in the science literature about pornography use. So can we let youth use pornography responsibly? That's a good question. You know, Dr. David Ley identifies that the internet offers a deep, wide pool of sexual experiences to people who we've never taught how to swim. And Dr. David Ley talks about providing youth with an ability to be vaccinated or inoculated if they are exposed to or if they choose to be exposed to pornography. And really, when you're thinking about adolescent development, teens question things. They want to think from themselves. This is kind of who they are as developmental beings, and it's about equipping them. And so if we frame it as a way of them being consumers of science and research, really bluntly sharing them what we know about the science and exposure to pornography and what that does to teens, what that does to adults, and what we don't know, that will really fit with their developmental level of questioning things and thinking for themselves and making decisions, and really address these issues or develop those skills of being critical thinkers for if and when they see pornography. And the biggest piece about that is really being porn literate, being media literate in general. Have them really grapple with, you know, what they did and didn't want to see in porn. Have discussions around that. What they did and didn't want to do during sex. What is degrading to women? What is unfair to men? What is racist in what you're viewing? Really teaching them and having discussions about healthy relationships and relationship skills and sexual consent and negotiation, safety and respect. Ultimately, it's really providing them literacy for this issue rather than avoidance of talking about it. I'm going to stop my screen share there, and I will pass it back to Bente.
Share screen. Can you see everything?
No.
No. Okay. I'm going to try that one more time. There we go. I think we've got it now.
Yes,
George?
you have it.
Fantastic. Excellent. So I can certainly say that my colleague and I, you know, we share a lot of the same principles and ideas around pornography use and working with youth. I too agree we need to remain sex positive. I too agree we really need to prepare our young folks for encountering pornography, because whether they intend it or not, with all of those unintentional or accidental exposures, it's going to come into their life. And it may come into their life via a partner as well. And so that preparation is key, I think, to really preparing them for how they're going to engage, how they're going to move forward, how they're going to negotiate and navigate a very complicated and ever-changing arena. I think in many respects, we're in the midst of the biggest social experiment ever around sexuality. Although porn's been with us for, you know, since time immemorial, not available in the way that it is now. The place of divergence with Melisa is I'm a lot more nervous about what the outcome of this experiment is going to look like. I'm worried for girls and women. I'm worried about the violence that gets connected to sex. But because the research isn't out there yet, the jury is still out, and we'll have to wait and see. But in either case, I think there's an onus of responsibility on us to try and prepare young people the best that we're able. The next piece I really want to chat with everyone about is a little bit around sexual scripting theory. And that really talks about how we engage in our own sexuality as we move forward in sex with other people, and where do those ideas come from? And sexual scripting theory really suggests that it's in what we take in that sort of lays down those sexual scripts. And part of what we take in, and particularly around the how to have sex, comes from pornography. And that has been identified multiple times now within the research. And so why does pornography have such a big impact? Why does it have more, shall we say, energy behind it than other pieces of information? Well, we know a few things now from some other disciplines outside of social work psychology. One of the things that we know about is this idea around the availability heuristic. And what that suggests is that if we have seen something in our experience, whether that's on television or in a film, that has created a strong arousal response in us, whether that's fear, disgust, or being sexually turned on. What that happens then is that when we go to that topic again later in our lives, and if that topic happens to be sex, then the first thing that's going to come into the brain is those images from that experience, because they suggest that the stronger the emotional response to it, the quicker it's going to come into the brain. And the same can be said around vividness and repetition. So if people are looking at a lot of pornography, that's what's going to come into the brain first in terms of providing those sexual scripts. The other theory that I think is quite interesting comes from media studies, and it's this idea around cultivation theory. And what cultivation theory suggests that as we immerse ourselves in whatever media it is, and if it's pornography, it's pornography, if it's, television, sitcoms, whatever it may be, that we come to believe that what we're seeing is what's actually happening in the world around us. So, for example, if somebody looks at a lot of pornography, the likelihood that they think that most people or lots of people are engaging in three-way sex is going to be more. Now, that by itself doesn't seem like a wholly problematic belief. But if we start to couple that then with, I'm trying to make, as a young person, if I'm trying to make my own sexual decisions, and I believe that everybody is engaged in threesomes, and not that I have anything against threesomes whatsoever, but it may really change the decision-making. If there's a belief, well, that's regular, everybody does that. And again, with threesomes, not a big deal. But what if it's violence? What if it's violence and pornography and that's regular? Then it takes on a bit of a different flavor. So that's where cultivation theory really comes into play. The other piece, Robert Jensen in his book really invites us to think about what the impact is of just continually seeing violence against women and whether it becomes a cause or not of sexual assault, just what that does to the brain. And he suggests here that rather than discussing simple causation, we should consider how various factors, and in feminist philosopher Marilyn Frye's terms, make something inviting. In those terms, pornography does not cause rape, but rather helps make rape inviting. And so again, really just laying that foundation that raping someone is regular, or that they see in pornography that a woman's tears or cries of "don't do this," in fact, increase everyone's arousal. And that sends some pretty confusing messages to young people if they don't have a real world sexual experience outside of that context. The other piece here is Julia Long did a really excellent opinion piece in the Washington Post. And she brought to the attention, she says, first and foremost, mainstream pornography consists of solely sanctioned acts of direct violence against women. What would be seen as sexual violence and brutality in other contexts is par for the course in pornography. And so really this idea that if you were to take so much of the behavior that's seen in pornography and shift that into any other context, taking the sex out of it, it would be seen as deplorable and illegal behaviors, right? And so it's just by coupling it continually with sex that it gets sort of put under this umbrella, well, it's okay because it's porn. The other piece is in terms of Johan Galtung talks a little bit about cultural violence and the play between sort of media and what we take in and what's violent and what happens in everyday lives. And I thought it was so interesting. There's a really interesting example here. The photo on the right is a Calvin Klein ad of a young woman. And this comes directly, this is an idea of upskirting. There's a whole genre of pornography called upskirting, which is, placing cameras around where people can take photos or videos of the undercarriages of women. And this ad sort of comes straight out of that genre and legitimizes it by placing it in a mainstream ad. So it's really just interesting, that back and forth play, the cultural violence, pornography, and how that sort of goes back and forth. And we certainly know that in relation to pornography, that it's become much more mainstream now. It's referenced in lots of sitcoms. It's referenced in lots of different places. So that's another piece, I think, to really think about. So in that place of agreement, Melissa and I talk about, really needing to create these good media skills in our young people and get them prepared. And I certainly know that many families, the way that, values in the family get passed along, or ideas get taught to their children or family members is, you're watching a show together and everybody's sitting there and they talk about, well, that person is a real dud because maybe they committed adultery, or maybe they stole some money at school, or whatever that might be. And so there's this really overt kind of discussion around what's happening in the show. Values get talked in our family. We don't do that. Those kinds of statements get made. The other piece that happens in these contexts, you're sitting around, you're watching reality television, and there's an opportunity then for the caretakers or the parents in the family to say things like, yeah, we know some of those reality TVs are scripted. We know that doesn't always happen in real life, or that isn't how it always goes. And so that sort of critical media skills start to take place. But what doesn't happen in pornography, we don't have families sitting around watching porn together to sort of deconstruct or take apart what's happening in pornography. All of the issues that would arise don't get talked about because porn is looked at mostly in private. And so that leaves us with an extra challenge in trying to prepare young people for this kind of work. I want to bring this to you, and this is a young person in a film. The film is called Love and Sex in the Age of Pornography, and it's an Australian film that was put together, I think, by the Australian government, had sponsored it, in fact, and it really talked to young people and about their experiences with pornography. And there's a young man in the trailer for this film that, and in the film as well, that talks about his own experiences with pornography exposure and consumption. And I just want to share with you in his own words what he said. And this is a direct quote. He said, yeah, the first time I had sex, because I'd watched so much porn, I thought, yeah, all chicks dig this. All chicks want this done to them. All chicks want it up here. All chicks love it there. So I tried all this stuff, and yeah, it was bad. So it's that he made concrete, really, this idea around what cultivation theory would suggest is that, if you've seen it 10,000 times in a video, that the response from a woman when she's hit in the face or called a name or spit on or choked is a pleasurable one. Why would one believe anything different is going to happen in the real world, as we say? So that's sort of the not so great outcome about all that pornography exposure. But regardless of your position or my position or what the research says on pornography, the most important thing as we move forward with the young people that we work with is, what does it mean for them? What does it mean in their lives? What does it mean in their future lives? How do they think about it? So I think that's really worthy of some discussion. So some of the very basic questions to consider on that front are, what do you think about porn and how easy it is to access it? How does it fit into your life? And what do you make of some of the violence that you see there? These are just discussion questions, and these can be asked of a lot of young people, because almost to the last one, they're going to know what you're talking about if you're talking about porn. It's not going to be the first time that they've been introduced to the concept. What are some of their own self-criticisms or beliefs about themselves if they use pornography? Would they want anyone to know? That can help you understand a little bit about their shame, potentially. What would it feel like to have one of your partners to use porn or to use it without you? I mean, those are just some really basic questions to sort of begin a discussion and see where it goes. And one of the things I'm going to come back to is one of the issues that Melisa had identified, this idea around moral incongruence, because this can be a really problematic piece for a lot of people. Let's imagine you're a young woman or a young man and you're going and you're looking at some pornography and you find yourself quite aroused by watching a rape scene. What does that mean about you? Does that mean you've got a propensity to be a rapist or that you want to be raped? Does it mean that if you watch some porn where there's some feet involved, for example, does that mean that you've got a foot fetish? Does it mean that there's something not quite right about you? So a lot of those questions can come up. And it's really about helping them take those pieces apart. And as for being sexually aroused to something that you find morally maybe not so great, sometimes the body works without us. And I think that's an important piece to explain to a lot of children and youth if they've got some worries about that in particular, this idea about because I watch it and I enjoy it, does that make me them? So to try and help them to separate that out, I think can be a really important piece if they've got those worries. And I can tell you, unless you ask, you're not going to know. This isn't something that a young person is going to come up to you and say, hey, by the way, I really want to talk about my worry that every time I watch rape in pornography, like I'm really turned on. That's not something that youth are typically going to bring. So you got to lay some foundations and find some ways to enter into that discussion. So with the preceding question of what do you make of the violence in porn, and laying the statement down that, lots of people that never engage in rape or don't want to be raped sometimes get turned on by that and feel pretty confused about it. That's a way to sort of invite a conversation in about that kind of thing. Robert Jensen has suggested some particular questions that young men might ask themselves before looking at pornography. For example, does a good guy ever try to get a female partner to watch porn with him to undermine her resistance to particular sexual acts that he wants, but she rejects? So do you use it as a way to get people to go along with you? The other piece is around girls in porn. What if I get turned on? We've talked about that already. Sexual scripts for girls. Should I copy what I see girls doing in pornography? Is that what men want? Is that what we're supposed to be doing? Am I supposed to want it rough? And I think this is a really important question around, does porn teach girls to enjoy misogyny? So should it be okay for my partner to call me names that I wouldn't normally allow in my life just because we're having sex? And we certainly know that agreements can be made within a consensual sexual relationship where there could be all kinds of name calling and it's okay. But that's different than just feeling like, oh, I got to go along with it because it's sex. The other piece I wanted to just talk about quickly was around sexual abuse, because this is a whole other kettle of fish, as they say. Pornography can have quite a different meaning. It can be very triggering for people who've got a sexual abuse history. There can be a lot of reenactments about what happened to them. Very often, pornography is used as a tool in sexual abuse. So people are shown porn as a way to instruct them in what to do. And if people have been used in online sexual abuse images, this too requires a lot of specialized work. And I know there's been other webinars that have really focused on that. I want to bring to your attention a couple of clinical tools that are available. One is the Sexual Decision Making Book, Your Personal Code. And this is for teenagers that are trying to figure out how they want to be in the world in relation to their own sexuality. So there's areas that look at relationships. There's a section on porn and what you're going to morally commit to one way or the other. And it's completely judgment free insofar as it's what they value, what they see as important. And that's available online. I think in the links page, it's available. The other tool I wanted to bring to your attention was this little book developed by several of our colleagues here at Radius. And they worked really hard on putting together this. It's a developmentally appropriate tool that's used as an adjunct with an assessment. So as you're completing an assessment on a child or youth, to really have a comprehensive and thorough look at their digital footprint. So it helps to really understand and chronicle a child's digital experience, all from a very neutral or non-judgmental place. And so there's a booklet, and again, that's available in the links as well, that will help you move through that. And there's also a couple of, adjunct books there that will give you the questionnaires and the activity books that you can go through and do. And it really helps you to get a full picture of a child's digital footprint. So it's a really excellent tool. I'm just looking at the time to make sure we leave our 5 minutes for questions. In the remaining slides, and you'll see them, they are easily downloadable, are just some discussion questions and activities that I've used very often in working with young people around pornography. So some questions around what's real or fake in pornography, and what about empathy? Does your use impact others? Or what about people that are in porn? What that's like for them? What's missing in porn? So all of those, consent, relationships. This one I think is important around gender expectations. What do you expect it to look like as a girl or a guy when you're going and engaging in sex? What about having hair over your vagina? Or what about if you don't have large breasts? What about if you don't have a large penis? What does that mean for you? And I think when we think about affect in particular around gender expectations, there's such a small range of available kinds of feelings that one can feel within pornography. But in the world of sexuality and in sexual relationships with others, there's a really large realm. And so I think that narrowing isn't very helpful. I think now we've really got to the end of the slides, and I'm going to open the floor for questions. There, I think we're back. Yes? Perfect. So questions along the side. Okay. I don't see any questions at this point. Melissa, any comments or questions?
I don't see any popping up.
Okay. I was rushing through my slides to try and make sure that I left my 5 minutes, and I didn't leave. I only left my 3, so that's good that we've managed to wrap that up. Any other final thoughts? Melissa?
I don't.
No. Well, I would welcome people then to look at the tools that I had spoken about. They're available on those links at on the one slide in the document that was shared. And thank you, everybody, for your time this afternoon. I really appreciate that. Always enjoy speaking about pornography, and have a really wonderful afternoon.